come to the negotiating table, but would also make a show of force to the Russians, who were now deciding to get involved in the Pacific War because the war in Germany had come to a close in May of 1945. And on one hand, the Allies were interested in introducing Soviet troop strength into the campaign against the Japanese, but on the other hand, they were afraid of introducing Soviet troop strength into the campaign against the Japanese, for fear that in the post-war world there would be a sort of face-off between Allied forces and Soviet forces in the East, just as there was shaping up to be one in occupied Europe. And to a certain extent, of course, this did actually materialize, particularly in the Korean Peninsula, which was divided between Soviet occupation and American occupation, and that, of course, was the foundation of the political division of the Korean Peninsula that continues to this day. So it was felt that the use of atomic weapons could demonstrate to the Soviets that maybe they better stay out of Allied affairs when it came to settling the post-war situation in China, Japan, and the Far East more generally. Of course, using the atomic weapons also had some disadvantages. There was, of course, a moral imperative here. Using these weapons would be crossing a technological line from which there was sort of little chance of return. Once the genie was out of the bottle with respect to nuclear arms, it couldn't be put back in. And this is a threat that we continue to grapple with, obviously, right up to the present day when it comes to geopolitical and strategic issues. And some military authorities wondered if it wouldn't be just as well to carry out the conventional invasion and be done with it, rather than to introduce these highly destructive new weapons. A fourth option, which at the very highest levels would have been attractive to a number of decision makers on both sides, was to reach some kind of negotiated peace settlement that would see the fighting come to a close without an invasion of Japan and without the use of the atomic weapons. So it wouldn't be that different, for example, than the armistice with Germany of November 1918, which saw the war come to an end without an invasion of German territory as such. And although there were some who were interested in this sort of negotiation on the Japanese side of the equation, they had the difficulty of contending with other Japanese decision makers, especially in the senior ranks of the armed forces, who basically wanted to continue fighting until the last man, woman, and child had been killed in Japan. So in other words, there was not a unified perspective amongst Japanese decision makers about the possibility of pursuing a negotiation in terms of peace talks. On the American side, because there was a political problem with respect to a negotiated settlement, because for the last 3.5 years or so, the propaganda machine in Washington had been telling everybody in the U.S. public how dangerous the Japanese were and how they couldn't be trusted, and that unconditional surrender was the only option for them. So there was some fear that getting into negotiations with the Japanese would cause some kind of public outrage in the United States, because it would seem that American decision makers were abandoning their own policy perspectives when it came to Japan. So this tended, as a consequence, to sway decision makers back toward the possibility of using the atomic weapons as a way of short-circuiting the military campaign and bringing the war in the Pacific to a close. I can say pretty confidently that a lot of ink has been spilled on the decision to deploy the two atom bombs over Japanese cities in 1945. That is the Hiroshima bomb on the 6th of August, which killed anywhere from 100,000 to 140,000 people, and the Nagasaki bomb of the 9th of August, which killed a further 50 to 70,000 people. Those who accept that this was a desirable and necessary decision argue that the fact that the Japanese did not immediately surrender after the first bomb was dropped indicates that embarking on any other type of strategy would not have led to a faster outcome or a faster conclusion to the end of the war. And that may be true, but I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. The reason why, as some historians have pointed out, is that whether we're talking about the moments before the 6th of August attack or after the 6th of August attack, it seems that the U.S. government simply did not make the fullest possible effort to open channels of communication with the Japanese authorities with the goal of pursuing some type of negotiated surrender. Now, we can understand on one case why this might have been true, because after all, it would have been politically unpopular to pursue a negotiated settlement with the Japanese after so much propaganda had flooded into the U.S. Public discourse against the Japanese over the previous few years. But on the other hand, it could have been possible to enter into negotiations and leave room only for very limited concessions that would convince Japanese decision makers who were sitting on the fence to stop fighting and put an end to the war. And one of the concessions which was suggested at the time was to permit the Japanese to keep their emperor, Hirohito, as the post-war head of the Japanese state. Because up until this point, it had always been assumed that Hirohito would be tried as a war criminal and probably executed. And there have been historians have suggested that if even a hint had been dropped to Japanese decision makers that Hirohito could stay in power, even as a figurehead during the U.S. occupation, that might have been enough to tip Japanese decision makers in the armed forces in favor of a negotiated settlement rather than fighting to the last man, woman, and child. And the irony, of course, is that in the end, the Allied authorities, in fact, did permit Hirohito to maintain his throne and to continue to function as a sort of figurehead for the Japanese people during the U.S. occupation after the war. And if that possibility had been communicated more clearly to the Japanese before August 6th, and if time had been permitted for them to respond, it's quite feasible to argue that the war could have been ended without an invasion, without a protracted siege of the home islands, and without the use of any atomic weapons. But without the knowledge that the emperor might remain on his throne, even after the first bomb of the 6th of August, the Japanese High Command was essentially unmoved and was prepared to continue fighting. And you may be wondering, well, how could that be possible after this incredible display of destructive capacity? And it was, of course, a display of destructive capacity that just one bomb could destroy pretty much an entire city center and kill over 100,000 people. But when we put this in the context of earlier in 1945, where nightly firebombing raids could destroy much of Tokyo and kill 80,000 people, Japanese decision makers who had really no knowledge of atomic weapons thought, oh, well, it's just more of the same. We're going to keep going anyways. So in that respect, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima did not necessarily represent the turning point for Japanese observers that we may assume that it did, because they had already been witnessing destruction of cities for months before August of 1945. Now, the other factor that comes into play here, finally, on the 8th of August, was the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. It had been mutually convenient for both the Soviet Union and Japan to maintain a treaty of non aggression throughout most of the Second World War. And this was not entirely satisfactory to the other allies who wanted to see the Soviets investing some effort in the war against Japan. But on the other hand, maybe it was ultimately attractive to the other allies because if the Soviets were not at war with Japan, then there would probably be little opportunity for the Soviets to expand their influence in the Far East and to further influence the civil war in China after the Second World War was over. And in fact, this reluctance to involve the Soviets in an extensive campaign against Japanese forces in Manchuria, for example, may explain why the Americans dropped not just one but two bombs in the first place, as sort of a show of strength to Moscow, to show what the U.S. military was capable of doing. Um, in any case, the Soviet declaration of war on the 8th of August, if it were to have been combined with some sort of diplomatic agreement to allow the emperor to maintain his throne, could well have led to an end of the war immediately without the need to drop the second bomb, or without any justification for dropping the second bomb at Nagasaki on the 9th of August. But the decision makers on the U.S. side simply didn't pause to consider that or to give time for that sort of exchange. Hence, we have the second bomb on the 9th of August. And after this bomb and the destruction that it caused, finally the emperor himself called on his people to surrender by the 14th of August. And this call was broadcast on speakers all throughout Japan, and it was actually the first time, as far as I'm aware at least, that the Japanese people had ever heard the emperor's voice. And really, any further holdouts in the military high command who were encouraging continued resistance were ultimately going to be drowned out once the emperor spoke, calling on the people to surrender. Given the and I really haven't done it justice, but given the complex array of factors that came into the decision making process here on the American side as well as on the Japanese side, it's very difficult to determine exactly what the decisive moment was that convinced the emperor and ultimately the Japanese people to lay down their arms, which of course meant there would be no need for um, a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands. But it seems to have been somewhere around the bomb of the 9th of August that we have the ultimate decision-making turning point. It's very difficult to make any definitive counterfactual statements about what could have been done differently, but certainly compelling historical arguments have been written suggesting that the war could have been ended in August or shortly afterwards through negotiation, through diplomatic channels, without the use of the bombs, but with the Soviet declaration of war, such as it was. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this week. Thanks.